Good morning, everyone. We're going to jump straight into the questions this time simply because we are short on time today. I have a Skype lesson in an hour, and you know how long winded I am. Oh, let's turn that off. Okay, sorry about that. I started adding a morning alarm so that I can get certain things done by 9:30 in the morning. I didn't think to turn it off today. All right, um, so the question we're talking about today is how do you get a good sound? And really, in my opinion, and I think all the other people who know what they're talking about, I'm not saying that nobody else knows what they're talking about but me. I'm not going to say that, right? But I do think that whatever they say is just a variation of what I'm going to say. And I think the way I have to say it is a little bit more like logical. But then that would be kind of biased because I'm the one saying it, right? So yeah. So let's talk about that. What are the components? What of not the components of a good sound, but what are the components of the approach that gets you a good sound? Okay, I think there's three aspects, three things that have to happen. If you want a good sound, three things have to happen. First, you have to develop a good sound in your ears first. You have to know what a good sound sounds like. That's number one. And that's of primary importance. Okay? Paramount. If you want to use fancy words, right? It's paramount that you know what a good sound sounds like. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. Second is you have to be able to hear what's coming out of your bell while you're playing. So that's number two, right? It doesn't matter how good what you hear in your head, that doesn't matter if you can't tell what's coming out of your own bell. And you might think, well, that doesn't make any sense. Everyone can hear what comes out of the bell. I don't think people pay attention. My experience as a teacher is that I'd say about 90% of the students are not fully aware of what's coming out of the bell. 90% of the students are not fully aware. This, by the way, I think is one of the reasons why when people say, how do you get a good sound? They'll say, practice long tones. And so this is why I like to teach sound this way, right? Practice long tones is part of it. Because practicing long tones helps you spend time. So you're playing longer notes and you have time. You don't have like all this technical stuff going on. You have time to focus on what's coming out of the bell. You're not being distracted by all this other stuff going on. That is one of the primary. It's not the only reason why long tones help, but it's the primary reason why long tones help is because you are now able to hear what's coming out of your bell. Now, here's the third step in the process. You have to be able to adjust so that when you hear, so you see the formula we're creating here, right? If you already know what a good sound sounds like, and the sound that's coming out of your bell, if you're listening to it, is not the sound that you know sounds good, you now have to adjust to make it sound good. And the adjustments that happen, I believe, are subconscious. I do not believe rarely is it something that you can say, okay, do this or do that. Do this with your lips, do this with your tongue, do this with your air. I think typically That's not going to happen. I think usually it happens on subconscious level. And I will even go as far as to say this. If it was something that you could do with your conscious mind, it wouldn't work always. I've seen that in some students. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about where this breaks down, right? We're going to talk about where this breaks down. But right now, I've seen students who were taught, because there are teachers out here in the Houston area that teach sound as a mechanical thing. They don't worry about this first stage where you learn to hear what a good sound is. They don't teach the second part where you actually listen to what's coming out. What they tell you, this is why they can do it in front of a whole classroom, right? What they tell you is do this with your air, do this with your lips, do this with your tongue, and that's supposed to give you a good sound. And that's when the confirmation bias kicks in too, right? What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is when you are biased towards something that you believe. And everything that would negate your belief, everything that would disprove what you believe, you ignore that. And everything that proves what you believe, you focus on that. You lift that up and champion it and all that stuff. We've got a lot of that in our society today. It's called confirmation bias. And what happens in the lessons, if you get a good sound after you've done these mechanical things that the teachers teach you, they say, well, see, I told you. If you don't get a good sound after you've done those mechanical things, which is actually more common, they'll say, well, you're not doing it, really. And see, that's easy to do with trumpet because most of what happens is inside. So they'll say you're not using your air right. They'll say your teeth are too closed or your teeth are too open or your tongue is too high or tongue is too low, right? But they can't see any of that. That's where the confirmation bias kicks in. And it's easy to have confirmation bias as a trumpet teacher because everything is internal. So let's go back and see where things break down, okay? How do you get this now we used to call it a model, right? Sound model. In the 90s, that was big. We used to call it a sound model, right? Where do you get a sound model in your head? Where do you get this concept of what is a good sound? From being around other trumpet players that are better than you. And I mean, we want to do much better than you. Okay? You want to be the little fish in the big pond, not the big fish in the little pond. Okay? And let's talk about, so we're talking about listening basically. And you guys have probably heard me before. If you're hanging out on my channel long enough, you've heard me say that listening is more listening is more important than practicing. And that's why we're saying that. It's because without that sound model in your ears, anything you do to get a good sound is not going to work. It's of absolute importance. You have to know what a good sound sounds like. And now let's talk about listening, right? There's a hierarchy of listening. Some listening is better than other listening. Some listening is more efficient than other listening. Okay, some listening is more powerful than other listening. So in my opinion, the best, most important listening you can do is sitting in the section next to a great trumpet player. I've had many opportunities in my lifetime to do this. When I was in El Paso, I was assistant principal of the El Paso Symphony, and got to sit next to my teacher. What an amazing experience it is to sit next to That was Sam Trimble at that time. What an amazing experience. And it wasn't just the symphony, by the way. I played a lot of gigs with him. That is the best listening you can do. Here in Houston, playing with Dennis Dotson, playing with Daryl Bear. When you have trumpet players who are that far ahead of you, sitting right next to you on the gig, that you cannot. That's another one. Buddy Sisco. You know, it used to be that my idea of a great lead player came from sitting next to this guy, Mike Middleton, a buddy of mine in El Paso. We were in the UTEP jazz band together, and he was the lead player. And that sound, his sound as a lead player, was what I used to hear in my head as a lead player. But then coming here and sitting with Buddy Sisco, gig after gig after gig after gig, I must have played 200 or 300 gigs at least with Buddy Sisco, I'm thinking. Same thing with Dennis Dotson. I ended up playing more gigs with Buddy because Dennis and I kind of sort of fill the same role. So a lot of bands wouldn't have necessarily hired me and Dennis at the same time. So I ended up playing with Buddy a lot more. But yeah, and then, the same thing also applies to other instruments, because there were some, like, for example, probably the most influential player in my entire career is David Caceres, because I was in David's band, right? So I was on the gig with him for 20 years. Easily, he's the most influential in terms of like the influence his music had on my playing. Now, in that case, we're talking about jazz playing. And he may not think, David might not think that he influenced me because I don't play like David. That doesn't mean that I haven't been influenced by him, right? The things I got from him were not what notes to play and stuff like that. The things I got from him were more bigger things on the macro level, not on the micro level. So you see my point, right? And here's, there's another sax player, Johnny Torres. So Johnny was a sax player and piano player on some of the gigs I used to play in the 90s. And the influence he had on my playing, now, out of all these people that I've listed, I've played with him the least, but he still had a tremendous impact on my playing. Okay, so what I'm trying to establish here is that even though, so you could say that the guys I have experience playing with are not as good as Freddie Hubbard, or not as good as Woody Shaw, or not as good as Maurice Andre, or Bud Herseth. But I promise you that the time I spent with them on the gig was far, far more beneficial to me, even though they weren't the best in the world. And I'm hesitant to say that because I don't want, if they ever hear this, I don't want them to think that I don't consider them great players. I consider them godsends to my career. They're extremely influential, great players to me. I think I've transcribed more Dennis Dotson solos than any other any other artist in my whole career. I've transcribed David Caceres solos because these guys are important to me, right? So I'm not saying. So don't get me wrong when I say they're not the best of the best of the best. I mean that's what they're not what other people would consider the best of the best of the best. There's some times when I'd rather sit down and listen to Dennis Dotson than to listen to Freddie Hubbard or Lee Morgan or somebody like that. So I consider them the best of the best, these guys that I'm talking about. Okay? But I'm not listening, you know, that's what I'm trying to say is the hierarchy is that's the best listening that you can do is on the gig with them. And I know I spent a lot of time talking about that. You know, this is why we want to go audition for Allstate. Is so that we can be around those other guys that are so wonderful. This is why we want to do these contests and stuff like that and not get our heads, you know, all big-headed and conceited like that and say, oh, I'm not going to audition, you know, they don't recognize me as a blah, 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 right? Because there are students like that. I don't think everybody should audition, but if this is something that's serious to you and you want to be the best that you can be, you have to be around other great players. And that's what those auditions are about. It's you know that old saying, you have to have money to make money. It's the same thing with being a great player. You have to get in fact, you know what? This is something Daryl Bear used to say, if I'm not mistaken. Daryl used to say, you have to have a gig to get a gig. Right? It's the same concept. You have to have a gig to get a gig. And that's what we're talking about. When you're sitting in the section with somebody else, nobody, that's unequal to anything else. And that's why you have to watch out. Now, let's talk about the lowest level. It's still beneficial, and you can make up for how the fact that it's the lowest level. You can make up for that fact by doing more of it. Okay, and that's the CDs and listening to recordings, right? Now, let's say hypothetically, the people who are in your band that you hear all the time sitting right next to you are horrible. Let's say the standards of your band are so low, and even if you're not first chair, you just know that this isn't good. What do you do about that? Well, then you get the CDs, you do YouTube, and you spend time. I tell my students that you need to spend at least as much time listening as you do playing with those guys, so you can wash that sound out of your ears. Okay? You want to wash all that out of your ears. If you're playing in a band with horrible players, and what's a horrible player? In my opinion, a horrible player is anything less than college level. And I mean good college level. There are some college students that aren't so good. So I don't mean just anybody in college. I mean someone who's like a great player at the college level. If you're playing, and that means all of you who are in high school. I promise you, all of you who are in high school that are watching this, you need to be spending at least, let's say hypothetically, you have 8 hours of playing in section with somebody, with these high school students that you're with. You need to spend at least that same another 8 hours listening to great trumpet players. And the better the trumpet player, the more beneficial the listening. Okay? Now, there are things in between. So we've got on one end, the highest in the spectrum is being in the section with a great player. The lowest in the spectrum is listening to CDs. Now we can have live performance. That's somewhere in the middle. And the live performance can be more or less beneficial depending on how close you are. So, like, I think there's and don't take this the wrong way, right? But if you go to the symphony hall and you're way, way, way up there, especially the way symphony's done today, right, with all the microphones and all that, that's almost not any much better than listening to a CD. But if you hear that same exact player at a brass quintet concert where you can sit 1 or 2 rows away. That's some extremely valuable listening. So if you see the guys from the symphony, now in almost every town, the symphony guys are almost always the best classical players in town. And that's true about Houston, in my opinion, right? They're the best classical guys in town. If you see that they've got a recital somewhere, go to that recital. It's much better to be close like that than it is to be 2 miles away from the trumpet player. Okay? So yes, we have different degrees of listening, but let's just summarize and say you got to do a lot of it to get that sound in your ears. You got to do a lot of it. Okay? We want that sound to stick in your ears. So now let's talk about the second part. This part about hearing what's coming out of your bell. You know, they used to sell in the 80s, I don't know if they do this anymore, it was like a clip. You know what? Now that I'm remembering this, that might not have been trumpet. Well, I'll go with what I'm remembering, right? It might have been a saxophone thing, but I remember them selling clips that you could put here and it would bounce the sound back to your ears. Now, I never bought any of that. What I did was stick my bell up into the wall, and I guess I'll demonstrate it. Oh, can you see? No, you know. So, used to stand like that up against the wall so that the sound would bounce back and we could, and it was just a nice way. You would do long tones into the wall so that you could hear every tiny imperfection. That's, and as good as that is, and I'm not going to tell you not to do that. I think it's a good exercise. You should do it. I just don't think it's enough. I don't, because you know what the thing is? You need to be listening always. You need to be listening to what comes out of the bell always. Always. You need to be so finely in tune with what's coming out, because otherwise it's impossible to play with a good sound. It's also impossible to do any of the other stuff that, like range. You know, I was just thinking about this earlier. The way you get a good sound and the way you get a good range, in my opinion, I don't see much difference between the two. Because first of all, both of them happen subconsciously. That's something that you've got to understand. Range is not something that conscious that you do. If you're still doing it consciously, you don't have that range yet. Let that sink in, right? If what you're doing to get quote unquote the high notes is something you're doing consciously and not subconsciously, and how do you know it's conscious or subconscious? Can you like read a book and do it at the same time? Can you do easy math equations in your head while you're doing it? That's a good test to see if it's conscious or subconscious. If you find yourself daydreaming while you're doing this stuff, it's subconscious. Okay, and that's what we want. Your subconscious mind is far more powerful, and so whether it's with range or getting a good sound or triple tongue or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish on a trumpet, it's always better subconscious than conscious. Okay, always, always, always. So yes, when we're talking about hearing what comes out of your bill, that's something that's got to be turned on all the time. But and you almost, because it's a subconscious thing, you almost have to call it an attitude. It's not something that you consciously do. It's more of an attitude that you have. I hope that makes sense. The idea of constantly listening to what comes out of the bill, if that's not going to be conscious, then it has to be an attitude. All right. So now let's talk about the the well, no, you know what? One more thing. If you have trouble listening to what comes out, I think sometimes it helps to record yourself, even if it's a horrible recording. Like phones, let me tell you about phones, recording with the phone. Phones aren't meant for recording trumpet, and it's always going to sound bad. I remember watching a video a while back ago, and the guy said, um, to make it more real, it was one of those trumpet challenges, which I don't, I'm not big on those trumpet challenge things. Yeah, and maybe it's because I'm not much of a social person, right? Um, um, but yeah, he said, let's keep it real, and everyone has to do it on their phone. And I'm like, that's not real. All that is bad. That's not real. That's just bad. Nothing real about that. If you understand the technology behind recording devices that are meant for the speaking voice, they have stuff built into it. Like, for example, volume controls. So, like, if you play loud and soft, it comes out the same. Okay, how is that real? And then there's noise limiting and stuff like that, noise cancellation. All of that stuff is in play. The phone doesn't know that you're now playing trumpet, so it's going to switch technology. Okay, so but that said, even as bad as recording on your phone is, if you make a recording of yourself and listen to it, that is like your first, it's like a baby step into hearing what's coming out of your bell. I hope that, I hope that makes sense. It's like a baby step in that direction. Okay. So yes, I do think that recording yourself, and you know what the guys used to do? I don't know if I haven't heard anyone say this in a long time. They used to slow the music down to half speed, right? Slow your recording down to half speed and listen to it as if you're a trombone player. And that's when you start hearing. And this reminds me of something I heard on a podcast, right? That's when you start hearing all the imperfections in your sound, right? And your articulation and stuff like that. And I don't remember what podcast this was, but I was listening to a podcast, and the teacher told the student to record himself and then listen at half speed. And I forgot what the comment was. It was something like how did the teacher know, or something like that? How did the teacher know that he needed to do that? And the teacher says, you know what? That half speed thing is for your sake. I can already. I think he even said, professional players can already hear those imperfections. But your ear is not trained well enough to hear those imperfections, so we slow it down, and that emphasizes those imperfections. And that's what and I like. So I should have done a better job of remembering exactly what his wording was. But I like that. because he was basically saying, you didn't hear that, but I did. And the reason I did is because I've been through all this before, right? That me as a teacher in your lesson, I can hear the imperfections in your playing because I already went through all that training, right? So that's what we're looking for is on that second um, part of this equation of how to get a good sound. That's what we're looking for, is having an acute awareness of what we sound like. Okay, so let's go to number 3. You know, you could have something wrong with any of these 3 steps, 3 parts of getting a good sound, and you will still not get a good sound. All it takes is for one of these to fall apart. So you have to be able to adjust to make the sound that you have fit with the sound that you have in your ears, right? That's where long tones come in. That's where your routine comes in. Now, in my case, my routines are designed to make this easier. You know, most of my students don't know we're working on sound. We don't, because it's subconscious, right? They don't know we're working on sound. And if they don't do the routine, now what I will tell them is that, so they'll come in sometimes and say that my band director told me I need to get a better sound. And I'll tell them, are you doing the routine? And usually they say, no, I haven't been doing it, or I'm doing it 1 or 2 times a week. If sound is a problem, you should be doing the routine 5 days, 6 days a week. Because that's why I put the routine together. The way the routine works, the biggest benefit of the routine is the sound. The biggest benefit, and that's all the routines that I teach. And that's without even doing, now we're going to talk about, before I let you guys go, we're going to talk about, you know what? Let me pause real quick because it's already 10 o'clock. I have to quit early. Are there any other questions that you guys have? If you do, type them now so that I can make space in my talk here about the sound. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking about the sound, okay? So what was I saying? We practice the routine and the exercises and stuff like that to give us the skill to match what we hear in our heads with what's coming out of the bell. My routine is designed exactly for that, and it doesn't matter which routine you do, because that's we talk about, that's what I was going to say earlier. There are things that will make you have a bad sound even though you're doing the other stuff right. I even wrote an article about that. I call it either 101 or 1001 ways to get a bad sound, or something like that. And that's if you're doing everything right, you still have a bad sound. There are things that can do that. And an example of that is chapped lips. If you've got chapped lips, you're going to have a bad sound. Okay? And stuff like that. And some of it's musically, chop oriented. Some of it is kind of superficial. So anyway, the exercise that we play in the routine, and it doesn't matter which routine, and you don't even have to be doing the alternations like what I teach. So we're not talking about at this point how to get rid of a bad sound. We're talking about how to get a good sound. Okay, so you don't have to do the alternations yet. Just doing the pyramid structure that my routines are based on will help you get a better sound. especially if you do it with all the tweaks that I teach. Okay, it will help you get a better sound. Because all the mechanics that it takes to get a good sound are tested in that routine. So the routine, that's the importance of having the routine. The routine gives you that skill to adjust. That's why we do the lip buzz. That's why we do the exercises in the order that we do them. Because it helps you learn to adjust so that you can get a better sound. All right? So that's what I'm gonna keep it there because I'm already running out of time. There are other things you can do physically, but if you're my student, and I'm treating all of you guys as if you're my student. If you're my student, you don't need to worry about all that stuff. Just do the routine. Do the routine on a regular basis, and you will get a better sound. Well, if you're doing that other stuff, right? Do the routine on a regular basis. Make sure you're doing your listening, and make sure you can hear actually what's coming out of the bell. And the routines will help you adjust in your performances so that you do get a better sound. Okay, now let's finish up here talking about what can make you have a bad sound even if you're doing the rest of this right. I get a lot of times students, here's one that just popped off the top of my head, and this is why I call the article 1001 Reasons Why You Might Have a Bad Sound, right? Now, before I say this, I want to stress one more time, you can't get a good sound without doing those three things. Listening, so you get a sound model, listen to what comes out of your bell so that you know what's wrong, and then adjusting. Those three things have to happen. The stuff I'm going to talk about now is the stuff that can screw that up. Okay? And you have band directors that tell your students, never move the trumpet. So they want you, no matter how what you're playing, they want you to keep the trumpet exactly perfectly static. That can, and I'm not going to say it always does, but that can cause you to have a bad sound. I don't hold my horn static. There are some types of players, depending on their embouchure and the way they play. Not everybody's the same, right? And not everybody plays the same. And to get the same result, two different people might have to do two entirely different things. Okay? But there's a lot of times when band directors say, don't move the trumpet, play it perfectly static. And that's what's giving them the bad sound. Other times it would be and a lot of times it's something a band director told them, and I'm not anti-band director. Don't ever accuse me of that. I actually have a lot of admiration for what they do. Okay? But that doesn't mean they're perfect and don't make mistakes. And I'm the one that has to fix the mistakes. The students come into me with all kinds of problems. I have to help them fix it. And you know what? To be fair, a lot of times it's not the band director's fault. It's the student's fault for misunderstanding the band director. A lot of times. I don't think that gets the band director out of it all the time. But, I mean, because like this whole thing, holding the horn static, I think there's a lot of band directors that teach that because they think that's what's right. Okay? But yes, this whole thing about so here's what happens. If the band, a lot of band directors do this, right? If you have that kind of, I call it lawnmower sound, right? If you have a lawnmower sound, a lot of times what the band directors will do is say, they assume it's like a knee-jerk reaction. And it's almost like what they were taught in college. This is what it seems like to me, right? they were taught in college that when you hear that sound, tell them this. So they hear that sound and they tell them that, right? Without actually finding out anything about the trumpet player. It's just a knee-jerk reaction that was programmed into their teaching, right? What I've seen many band directors say that when you have that you need to open your teeth. If you have that nasal sound, and the thing is, I'm not even closing my teeth to get that sound. Okay? So a lot of times the student will hear you say, open your teeth, and the teeth weren't the problem in the first place, and now they've got a bad sound because you told them to open their teeth. And the same thing about air, by the way. They hear a bad sound. There's other band directors that think everything, the answer is air. If you have bad sound, then air is the answer. Well, here's the problem. If you push more air and you don't adjust here, you don't change anything in your face, it's the equivalent. It's the mathematical equivalent of pinching. If you don't change anything and all you do is push more air, it's the mathematical equivalent of pinching. So once again, the band directors are saying stuff that are making the sound worse. And here's the problem with it, is because it creates this like loop. And the students say, oh, I've got a bad sound. Let me push more air. And it makes the sound worse. And because it's worse, they say, oh, let me push more air. How often have I seen this in my studio? This is not how you fix a bad sound. And in fact, most of the time, I think you should just leave the bad sound alone. I know that sounds blasphemous to a lot of people. If you're doing all the stuff, if you're doing those 3 things that I told you to do, why are you worried about getting a bad sound? Almost always, when my students come into the lessons, the stuff I have to fix is something somebody told them wrong. Okay? And there are things like chapped lips and stuff like that will also give you a bad sound. Stuff that you can't blame on the band director. Right? All right, let's see. What do you practice to get a better sound? I've seen to play really quiet, like 5P. And so you know what? I don't know how much of this you've seen, how much of this video this is exactly what I'm talking about. I don't believe that's how you get a good sound. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Do those 3 things that I'm talking about. That's how you get a good sound. Don't. So like you say, play whisper tones is what they call that. You put 5P. That's, some people call that whisper tones on the trumpet. I don't believe that's how you get a good sound. It's not what you do. Now, I do believe that my routine. Okay, so where the exercises come in. So I'm not going to say don't do that stuff. I'm not going to say don't do that stuff. What I'm telling you is that stuff doesn't work if you're not doing the other 2 things. You have to be listening to trumpet players. You have to hear. I think, see, I'm out of time. You're going to have to go back and listen to the beginning of the video. Okay? Because that's what I've been talking about this whole time. Okay? So, yeah. So the biggest thing, I'll summarize it right now, but then I have to get off because I have a student. Number one is do your listening. Listen to great trumpet players, and I talked about that in detail earlier. Okay? Number two is get to where you are acutely aware of what comes out of your bell. Listen to what comes out of your bell. And I said that it's an attitude, not necessarily something you try to do. It's an attitude. Always be aware of what comes out of your bell. And then we only talked about doing my exercises, but we want to do exercises that help us make the adjustment between the two. Okay? All right. Well, I need to go because I have to get ready for my student. God bless you guys. I'm glad you could hang out with me. And we will, if you have questions that you want to ask, please go to eddielewis.com and ask them there. And we can talk about them in the next one of these. Okay? These are going to start getting sparse. We're not going to do these every week because the season is here. The season is upon us. And I have gigs. And so, yes, we will do as many as we can. I might end up changing the day, but we'll see. All right. Well, God bless you guys. See you on the next one. Later.